Hey, how's it going? My name's Donovan Patrick Mahoney, and this is my vlog. Um, so I was thinking about my dad today and this thing that happened in rehab. I was adopted in 1982, just about a year and a half after my mom died, and I grew up way different than, like, culturally. It was two totally different worlds from my birth parents. My mom was native. We regularly went back to the reservation. My mom and dad were alcoholic, and I don't know about drugs. I mean, I was young, but I would assume that they were into drugs. They were super irresponsible, though. Like, I remember being left alone for sometimes a day. I can't really say for sure if it was more than a day, but definitely left alone for a day at a time. There sometimes wasn't food. There was definitely no rules. So yeah, like, when I went from living like that, and there was always, like, insecurity too. Like, there was shelter insecurity, there was food insecurity. So we moved a lot. There was no set food times. Like, if food was there, we just ate it. And when I got adopted, it was so intense. Like, I was born here in Vancouver, and the people that adopted me, the Mahonies, they lived in Courtenay at the base of Mount Washington, and they had acreage. They had a driveway, like a legit driveway that you couldn't see the house from the road. Like, that's how big the driveway was. It was long. They were non-Indigenous. My dad was from England, and my mom, I think she's has Italian heritage. I don't know a lot about her, but she was from Lethbridge. My dad had come to that marriage with two kids of his own, two boys. They had two kids together, so they had Sean and Carissa. And before we had arrived, they had taken on a permanent foster kid who was severely handicapped. And so there was already 5 kids there when I arrived, which, like, you wouldn't think is a big deal, but it was a super big deal. I had spent the majority of my life alone. My sister wasn't born until I was 4 years old, and so she had only been in my life for a couple years before we got adopted. So that was a whole other thing. They didn't watch, they didn't even have a TV. I don't think we had a TV. No, there was no TV. They didn't listen to music. They were super Catholic. And there was rules. There was bedtimes, there was dinner times, there was chores. We had to go to school. Like, it felt abusive, like, and that's how I experienced it. So when I got adopted, I thought that I was being abused. And later on, a few years later, when I started running away, I was actually going to the ministry and telling them that I was being abused. And it wasn't until, like, probably 6 years ago that I realized that I wasn't being abused, but having safety, security, food security, structure felt like abuse. And that's so wild to like look back on and think, you know, nothing and nobody could have prepared my family for that, or me for that matter. But anyways, almost like immediately when I was adopted, I remember having troubles with my dad, and he was just like a very stoic man, and he was the head of the household. He had his own chair. He sat at the head of the table. He would like, they were really big on etiquette, you know, setting the table, dressing right. So like you had your school clothes and you'd get off school and there was like, you had to get changed out of your school clothes into your play clothes. And, but yeah, so me and my dad started having problems almost right away. And I almost felt like he was like constantly at me about something, like everything. I was eating too much. I was being too loud. I was being too noisy. I didn't speak right. You know, like I had a heavy native accent at the time. I wasn't articulate, and yeah, so we were just at it like right from the get-go. And as I, you know, like I didn't stay in that household for too long, actually. I started running away when I was 9, and I remember the last time that I ran away, I'd been kicked out of school, and I was making myself lunch, and it was just me and my dad home, and he was just at me about everything, the way that I was making my sandwich, you know, like I was cutting the cheese too thick, and I was putting too much mayonnaise, la la. But I remember when he said that about the cheese and just being like, fuck you, I'm leaving. And he said, okay, see you later. And I ran away and I never came back. I never, ever, after that, went back to that household and lived there as a member of that family again. And I was 11 years old. And over the coming years, our relationship got more and more strained because the ministry wanted to reconcile the relationship. They wanted us to work through it. So we had to go to group therapy or to family counseling. And I went through a whole bunch of shit. I ended up being put in a psych ward, in an adult psych ward when I was like that year. I was in an alternative school. I ended up going to a child psych unit in Victoria, and then finally a personal development program in Headley. And all the while, like, my parents had to show up. Like, they had to go to each one of these places and they had to come and visit and all this and that. And when he would come and visit, I felt like he was always poking, you know, he would make comments about my long hair. I used to have long hair, and yeah, it was just a really super strained relationship, and I really grew to hate him. And so fast forward to 2007, when I first started getting sober first time that I would actually stay sober for any length of time started in 2007. And I was at this supportive recovery house, and I don't remember exactly what happened, but I got found out about hating my dad. And basically the head counselor told me after group, I think in group I had outed myself by like just trashing him. I was just like, you know, the guy's a piece of shit and he's a fucking loser, and going on and on and on. And all of a sudden the group got really quiet, and he said, the head counselor said, you know what? After group, you go write your dad a gratitude letter. And I was like, how am I going to write a gratitude for a guy that was basically a piece of shit? And he was like, well, I'll tell you what, you write a gratitude letter or you pack your shit and get the fuck out of here. Because if you can't, or you're not willing to do the work to be in this program, then you may as well go back to the street and get loaded. And I just thought, man, this is so crazy. And so group got out, and I went and had lunch, and I remember going and sitting outside. And at the time I was still really afraid of writing, because I had a lot of really self-defeating beliefs about myself as a person, as an educated person. I didn't think that I was educated. I didn't think that I could write. And so there was already that whole thing going on. And then sitting there and trying to think about how I could write a letter to my dad, a gratitude letter. Like, it seemed like absolutely impossible. And I don't know why I even wanted to try, but I just wanted to stay sober so bad, and I didn't want to get kicked out of that place. The idea of failing this treatment center or this recovery house was it was way scarier than trying to sit down and figure out how to write this letter, this gratitude letter. So I started writing, and I started thinking back, and I don't know how I managed to shift my perception, but I just remembered this moment, like, where I was coming home from school, and we used to take the school bus after school. It's one of those big, long, yellow school buses, and a bus driver's name was Glenn. And when it was coming to my stop, I went running up to the front of the bus, and Glenn had slammed on the brakes, and I fell forward and cracked my head. Cracked the mirror basically with my head, and I was like, oh no, and I thought I was in trouble. And so I went running up the driveway, and my dad was standing at the top of the steps. And there was this thing like that I learned there about lying. They just always seemed to know everything. And so it was always just, I think I got busted early on, like lying a lot, and they just kept putting it on me, about being a liar, and I just felt so stupid. So, and there was this thing, like my mom would say, tell us before we find out from someone else, because you won't get in as much trouble. So anyways, there's my dad, and he's sitting on the steps, he's standing there, and he's like, don't even come in the house. We're going back into town. And I was like, oh my God, I'm in so much shit. So I get in the truck, and we're driving downtown, or driving back into town, and I'm like, Dad, it wasn't my fault. Like, this is what happened. I was running down, and then Glenn stopped the brakes, and I broke the mirror with my head, and it wasn't my fault. And he said, okay, well, we'll deal with that later. But he was very stoic. And we pulled up to Shoppers Drug Mart, and I was like, what are we doing? And he's like, we got to go in here for a second. And we go in and we go to the customer service, and he says, and he's just like, his face lit up, and he's like, this is my son, Donovan, and he won the coloring contest. And I looked at him and I was like, holy shit, like, wait, I'm not in trouble. And it was from that moment I realized my dad was so proud of me. And I'm writing this letter and I'm thinking about this story, and he was so proud of me, and he was so stoked to do that, like that I'd really, I'd done something that, my family thought it was significant. I thought it was significant, like out of all the kids that entered in a coloring contest in Courtney, I was the kid that won, and I'd entered every year. I never won a coloring contest, but yeah, so, but connecting with that, all of a sudden, it started to open up and help me to like look at him in a different light as I was writing this letter. And I started to stop seeing the things that he had said to me. I started to see his actions, like the kind of person that it takes to want to adopt somebody, another person's child. You have your life and you want to give somebody else a life, a chance. And all of a sudden I just started to just see like, wow, this guy was so amazing. Like he had such a humongous heart. In the 80s, I remember there was a recession and work was hard. My dad ended up taking a job and he was gone for like a couple months at a time. And his family was his life. Like he didn't have any friends. It was literally my mom and my dad and us kids. And that was it. And so I started to realize that like, yeah, his words may have not been the best, but his actions were really incredible, to take in a person, taking two kids, not let alone one kid, but two kids, that Native kids, at that time, like there was a huge stigma around Natives, like racism was like very heavy duty in the 70s and 80s towards Natives. Like it was not good. Courtney was like a very white place, and he took us in. But anyways, I got through the letter and I barely got to the end, and I was just bawling my eyes out, and everything shifted for me. And I guess that was like, when I first realized, all these sayings and people say, talk about gratitude and this and that. Gratitude is essentially a different word for love. And love can dissolve anything, can dissolve contempt and hate and that darkness. And by stopping carrying that much darkness in my heart, I think it was one of the main reasons why I ended up staying sober for the next 4 years after that, was because I started to live in love and start to appreciate life for what it was. I was able to start to look past words and actions. So yeah, I just wanted to talk a little bit about that tonight, and just to give like a really solid example of the power of gratitude and how it can transform your life. And yeah, sometimes it's not easy because feeling bad feels so good, and it can give you purpose and it can give you an identity for a long time. But yeah, so anyways, that's it for now. I've been talking for 20 minutes. If you stuck it through to the very end and you appreciated this story and this video, definitely give me a like. And if you haven't subscribed, definitely subscribe. And if this content's something that you're feeling, hit the notification bell. I'm going to be doing these videos every day. I've said 30 days. Who knows? Might go longer. So, thank you for letting me be of service and giving my life purpose. Namaste.